Okay, this week what we're talking about, inflation has jumped and the Bank of England has warned that it will go up further in 2025. What does that mean for us? What does it mean for interest rates, for mortgages and for the wider economy? As you can see, it's a Friday, so I'm in my somewhat casual attire. So what are the key points? Inflation rose to 3% in January, up from 2.5% in December. The highest level for 10 months. This is above forecasts and raises concerns that inflation could be stickier than expected. While inflation is still lower than last year's peaks, the unexpected jump adds pressure to the Bank of England's plans for rate cuts. In a short while, we're going to go through what is inflation, what does it mean, where does it come from, why it's important and why it isn't important. So please do listen on and we might learn a bit more in depth. The increase in inflation was driven by food prices, VAT on private school fees and airfares, which didn't drop as much as usual. Now, I don't know if you've noticed since COVID, but airfares are monstrously expensive. I can't believe they are going to drop at all. The government's VAT change on school fees has led to higher costs, whilst stronger consumer demand and higher input costs have kept food prices elevated as well. So there's a lot of a bit of things in the smorgasbord of inflation pushing it up. Core inflation, which is where you strip out food and energy costs, also climbed to 3.7%. Reinforcing concerns that inflationary pressures are not just limited to energy price fluctuations. This is a key measure of the Bank of England watches to make interest rate decisions. It's thought that interest rate cuts might be delayed, with the Bank of England expected to take a more cautious approach. By some pundits, markets have been pricing in cuts in June and in fact 3 times this year, but now they're saying it might not happen until later on in the year. Next Bank of England Policy Committee meetings on the 20th of March. Wage growth is outpacing inflation, which is basically means it's gone up by 5.9% wages, which is great because it's making people have a bit more money in their pocket. But at the same time, it will fuel inflation, making, again, the Bank of England hesitant to make rate cuts. Now, Andrew Bailey, the governor, and his colleagues are saying a slowdown in job market is likely to keep a lid on higher wage demands, which will keep pressure down on inflation, which is very positive. And market watchers and economists are still surveyed by The Economist are still saying that they believe there will be 3 more rate cuts this year. Not because it's safe to do so, i.e. it's safe to go out in the water again. It's because the Bank of England is trying to stimulate the economy. And, as we said last week, the Labour Party's changes won't kick in for the next 2 to 3 years. So it's a long time to wait when the economy could well go into deflation or stagflation. So what next? Inflation is also going up in the US and Europe. The Fed has said that they're watching it very closely and won't be doing any increases or decreases until they're sure of which way it's going. So the UK is part of a global trend. Now, what is inflation and what causes it? Inflation is classified into 3 types: demand pull inflation, cost push inflation, and built-in inflation. All 3 of these are related to the equilibrium between the supply of money and the supply of goods in a country's economy. Now, demand pull inflation occurs when the demand for goods and services, in other words, the overall amount of money and or credit people have to spend, goes up quicker than production capacity. Okay, so we're all getting wealthier, there's not enough stuff out there, so prices go up. So demand is high, but supply can't keep up. Now you've got cost push inflation, a result of increasing cost of production. For example, if the raw materials used to create the product increase in price, the price for final goods rises as producers pass their costs on to the consumer. Now that is really what we're experiencing in the UK, is because we've got the Ukraine war, we've got a cost of living crisis, and the cost of living crisis is basically cost push inflation. And then the final sort of inflation, have is built in, occurs due to expectations that inflation will continue, so wages must rise in order to maintain a status quo. As the prices of goods and services increase, labour expects to be paid more and more to keep up with it. Cost of living rises. So we have a bit of that as well. So they're the basic 2 types of inflation we're suffering from, but not the demand side of it. Now, so you think we've got it bad. So what are the top 10 countries with inflation around the world? Okay, Venezuela, 283% per annum. Now, have a thought for them. My daughter was recently in Venezuela and she said you go into the shops and they didn't have prices on anything, which made you very suspicious they were just making it up, especially if they weren't speaking her language. But they can't put prices on it because by the time you get it to the till, it's gone up in price. You then got Lebanon, Argentina, Syria, Turkey, all with plus 60%, down to, I think, Suriname about 38. In the past, in Venezuela, inflation has been 1,000,000%. I mean, that's unbelievable. At one stage, Venezuela's economy was the envy of South America because it had a large per capita wealth due to the largest oil reserves in the world. However, such heavy reliance on petroleum, lack of diversification, left the country vulnerable to fluctuations in oil prices during the 1980s, 1990s. So when you had $100 a barrel, happy days, but when it's 30, not very happy days. So the country's economy spiraled. They haven't diversified enough and done enough to do that. Places like Sudan have got a 340% inflation rate, second highest in the world. It's increased drastically, driven by food, beverages, and a black market in US dollars. Basically, if you have a war going on, that is a recipe for inflation. Countries with the lowest inflation rates are basically in the opposite side of the problem, in that they have deflationary pressure. Deflation generally arises in the opposite scenario to inflation. In other words, when the supply of goods and services outpaces the supply of available money in the economy, causing prices to decrease as a result. Deflation can also occur when buying power grows due to a reduction in the money supply or a decrease in the supply of credit, or actually the value of the currency. When I first moved to Malaysia, it used to be 3.8 to the pound. At one stage it got to 7. So that was a disinflationary environment where things got cheaper and cheaper. And the countries that are sort of ahead of the list, Cameroon minus 16%, Afghanistan minus 8. Those sort of countries you can see are all going to be experiencing that sort of deflation. So what is the ideal rate we should be looking at? The Bank of England says 2%. The Fed in the US says 2%. That is what they aim at, and that is what we should be targeted on. So basically, that's a quick round the world tour of inflation, what it's all about. You know, the UK is just 3%. It'll probably go to 3.7% at one stage this year. That's nothing to worry too much about. Okay, as long as we're not up to 10% and 12%, where we're in the bad books then. So that's pretty good. So hope that was useful. Now some questions for the past few weeks. Brum GP 3 days ago. What a lovely person. Another engaging and important video. Thank you. Could you share your views on buying flats versus houses in good geographical locations? What are your thoughts really growth long term? Houses are always great because you have very few costs with them. You have no ground rent, you have no service charge, and people are normally quite stable who move into houses. So it's a great long-term buy. Tends to be a slow burner and go up longer term. With flats, you're buying them in places that are close to work as a rule. So you tend to get someone, say at HSBC in the centre of Birmingham, living in a flat half a mile away, whereas they're unlikely to want to go and live in a house 5 miles away. So you get a different sort of tenant, and sometimes people who are just short-term professionals give you a better yield on your property. So short-term flats tend to be a bit better. Longer-term houses do better. The wear and tear on flats is greater. On houses it's not, but the cost of looking after a house with a garden perhaps and driveways and stuff is more expensive. So you've got to balance it out. The most recent properties on the market, the flats that is, don't have ground rent. They normally have a 999-year lease with a £1 a month, basically nominal ground rent. Okay, so depends what you're trying to do. If it's an investment and you're trying to make money on it in the shorter term, then probably a flat in the centre of town does well. If it's an investment and you're looking at longer term, then houses are good. Thank you very much for that question. Nice one. Okay, RavJ208. A lot of very disappointed people out there convinced the crash was looming and didn't buy when they had a chance. For many, it's too late as prices have shot up and will continue to rise. Absolutely. There's places that I've sold in the past that I regret deeply because I think once you're bought, you should never sell. I've seen a gentleman this week who's an Australian, and he said he's got property around Asia and in Australia, but he worked in the UK for 10 years, and his biggest regret is he didn't buy in London when he was working there. It's not going to stop. And I know it is a constant bone of contention with a lot of people who watch this, that they think it will stop. It won't. The fundamentals are not there. You're not going to have a crash. I could be eating my words in 2 years' time, who knows? Mike Eldridge, by the look of it, says, based on your experience of the 18-year property cycle, where in the cycle do you think we are now? Well, after COVID going through the roof, you've got to be and prices going through the roof, we've got to be at the end of the cycle. And we're probably going into a period of stagnation. So I can't see property prices going up that much over the next 2 to 3 years, if at all. We're going to have still properties falling on the coastlines because people have to go back to the city centres to work. We're going to see country properties falling. So I believe we're at the end of the cycle, and now is the time to buy if you're a contrarian investor. If you're like a JP Morgan, buy when everyone else is selling. They're not actually selling at the moment, but they might start thinking about it. Once this stamp duty little bump up goes, things will be just dragging along, I think. And so that's the stage we're at. And I'll suggest a new cycle will start perhaps in 2 to 3 years' time. And that's when you should be starting to acquire stuff. If you're brave, you know what you're doing, start acquiring it now. If you're doing it because you just need to buy somewhere, then do it now. But if you're worried, then wait. Thanks for that. Very good question. Thank you for watching. Market route number 245, Stuart Williamson, in a original Mambo shirt. It's over 20 years old. Okay, they're rare. That's an investment. I can make money on that by selling it on eBay. Thank you very much. Cheerio.